Ooh.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's storyboard, brought to you by Geek and Sundry and Powder Milk Biscuits. This week, we're going to be talking with our lovely guests about character. What makes us love characters, what makes for a good character, what makes for an empathetic character. We're just going to see where it takes us. And this week we have the lovely and talented Amber Benson.
Hi, I'm Amber Benson. Is this where I introduce myself?
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Amber Benson, as Pat pointed out. That's a good thing. I'm also the girl with the most cake, at least at this party. I'm an actor and a writer and a director, and I don't dance as well as I do those other things. So there's that. I have a blog, Amber Benson Blogspot. Amber Benson wrote this.blogspot.com, and I write a series of urban fantasy novels called the Calliope Reaper Jones novels, and I have a middle grade book called Among the Ghosts.
And we are also joined by the lovely and talented Brad.
The one who cooks.
Give us your last name, too, because I was in fear of mispronouncing it.
All right, I'm going to share with everybody the trick so you can learn it and never forget.
Okay.
It's Bollier, so you say bowl your ass off without the ass off.
Oh, there we go.
So there you go.
That's a great trick. Paolo Bacigalupi, when I saw him for the first time, he actually, during his keynote speech, he sang his name and made everyone do it, and I've never been able to forget it ever since.
And how did it go?
It was, well, I don't remember the tune, but I remember how to pronounce Bacigalupi, which was a mystery to me before. So yes, tell us how fabulous you are, Brad.
I am a writer of epic fantasy. I do some short fiction as well, but I have a epic fantasy series, trilogy called The Lays of Anaskaya from Nightshade Books. The first and second of which are out now, the third of which is coming out next year. And I'll put in a quick plug for a podcast that I run, of which 2 out of the 3 guests on the show, besides me, have been on, Pat and Mary. It's called Speculate. It's at speculatesf.com. And I have to say, Pat, I was all kind of proud of myself that we were doing this cool podcast thing, and now I feel totally out of my league with this whole Hangout thing.
Well, I feel totally out of my league with this Hangout thing,
even, I guess.
As evidenced by the fact that this Hangout is actually happening today despite me, not because of me. It's really happening because of the lovely folks at Geek and Sundry and these 3 wonderful guests who have agreed to do this very much on the spur of the moment, despite the fact that they have all returned from busy conferences where they were all weekend. So, Mary.
Yes. Hello, I'm Mary Robinette Kowal. I won the Campbell Award for Best New Writer in 2008. Last year I took home a Hugo Award for short story. So I write short stories. I love saying that sentence, by the way. I just have to say
Yay, Mary.
I write short fiction and novels. In short fiction, I'm kind of all over the map. In novels, I write historical fantasy. My first book is called Shades of Milk and Honey, and we describe it as kind of like Jane Austen with magic. And then I'm also a professional puppeteer.
You just threw that one out there like a grenade, didn't you?
Because I'm going to talk about it, and it may as well.
That's good. That's foreshadowing.
Yes.
And I am your host, Pat Rothfuss, and let's just jump right into it. I think it might be best to start by maybe talking about a few of the characters we love the most, because I tried to think of authors who I knew wrote good characters, but then I realized I wasn't getting anywhere. Then I thought, well, what characters do I remember? What characters do I love? And that's how you remember it. And sometimes I remember the characters' names better than the authors who wrote those books. So who does everybody like? Who do you remember from what you've read? And we don't need to necessarily keep this 2 books. This is all character, all story, all night.
All night long.
So, who do you remember as these favorite characters, these powerful characters, and what do you think that the key is there that actually makes them so solid?
Well,
you go, Mary. There
Okay.
you go.
One of my favorites is Vlad Taltos from Stephen Brust's series Taltos. He's an assassin, and it's first-person narrative, but he's really complicated, and because it's first-person narrative, you get to the way it's written. You really get to get deep into his thought processes, and it's interesting watching the way he changes over the story. And I think that's one of the things I personally really like when I'm reading a character is watching them change because of the things that they're going through.
I keep thinking about Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, and I think one of the reasons why I liked that character so much is because I related to it. Like, it was so well drawn, but like there's a moment where he talks about like loving the mass of humanity, but like not liking people individually. And I was like, oh, that registers. I think when something is real and it comes from a real place and it feels real to the character and from the author, I think we as an audience relate to that. And I was like, oh, that's my problem. Like, I love the idea of humanity, but dealing with people on a one-on-one basis sometimes can be so overwhelming and hard to take. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I totally. I've just come back from a convention. Yes.
Me too.
I'll mention a couple quickly. One from kind of a classic, Lord of the Rings. People kind of gravitate towards characters like Frodo, Gandalf. But one of my favorite characters, and I was reminded of it when I watched the movies not too long ago. Boromir is probably the most interesting character to me because he is the most conflicted. I think when we start talking about characters, we quickly get to complications, and that makes them deeper, more interesting. The other character I'll mention is from a TV series. If we have any Sopranos fans out there, one of my favorite characters is Chris Moltisanti, who goes through a lot of changes. He's caught between kind of the young punk in the early part of that series, and he grows into a kind of a captain, a made guy. Meanwhile is caught between his love of writing movies and gets caught up in drugs. He's a fairly dark character that's also likable. So those are my two.
And that's one of the questions I've been wondering about. Do you have to like these characters? I mean, it's easiest to have a great character that you like, but I was trying to think of characters that I've read and that I remember that I wouldn't necessarily want to ever meet or be friends with, or that I might not even enjoy them, but they were great characters at the same time. And I had a much harder time thinking of those. It's easier to think of, for me, it's Cyrano de Bergerac is this amazing character, and of course I'd like to be Cyrano's friend, or of course I'd like to be Cyrano, right? He's got so much going for him, and on top of that, he's also conflicted, and so he's more interesting and more realistic. But it's easier to have those. Well, and actually, I just came up with one: Marv from Sin City. More the comic books than the movie, although the movie was pretty good. I mean, Marv in Sin City was like a real full-blown bad person, like wired wrong in the head, a sociopath, or hurt people. But you're really, by the end of the book, you're kind of cheering him on and you love him.
I think that's actually true there are a lot of characters, particularly in epic fantasy, or in fantasy in general, that are not people that you would ever want to spend time with. I mean, Han Solo,
yeah,
love him, but he's a liar, he's a cheat, he's a smuggler, self-serving, totally self-serving. so this is not somebody that you would want as your BFF, but he's funny and he's charismatic as all get out. And I think you can skate past a lot of things if you've got those attributes. But I was thinking of, as you were talking about characters that people don't like, the Stephen R. Donaldson Thomas Covenant series.
Yeah.
I mean, Thomas Covenant. Yeah.
that's the bell ringer example right there. I remember I started reading that, and I got like 150 pages in the book, and I'm like, why am I doing this to myself?
Yeah.
And my mom had actually put a Post-it in the book because I borrowed it from her, and she's like, pretty awful, huh? And she goes, keep going. The story is worth it. And I'm like, okay, But you're right. I mean, you have to think that the author specifically said, I want to see if I can write a book about a guy that has like no redeeming social value.
Yeah.
Have you guys watched Dexter?
Those books too, the Dark Redeeming Dexter. They're very close to it. They stayed very true to the books.
Yeah.
Another one that jumps to mind, a more recent example, is Mark Lawrence's Prince of Thorns. He has a young character, I think he's around 13 or so, and maybe younger, when an event happens. His mother is killed and raped and killed, and then his father treats with the people that did that to her, and he becomes essentially a sociopath. And so, like these other characters, he's not at all sympathetic, but it's completely gripping reading, just the same.
I'm a big fan of like Jim Thompson, like Population 1280, like the sheriff in that is totally, And then Ian Banks is great with those sort of like anti-hero, like the Wasp Factory. Holy my God! But you can't stop reading because you're so intrigued by these crazy, like sociopathic characters and how their mind works. It's so different than how mine works.
I think that's part of the key, though, is understanding, getting a glimpse into someone else's mind. I think that's part of. Like when you decide that you're going to have the character who's not sympathetic, you're paying a cost. It is harder, I think, for the audience to engage. But part of the reason they will engage is because it gives them an insight into something that they don't experience otherwise. Since we're talking about sociopaths, Dan Wells' book, I Am Not a Serial Killer.
Yeah.
Oh, I haven't read that.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Ooh.
It's really good. Basically, 15-year-old kid recognizes that he has all of the markers for being a serial killer. And the only reason he's not diagnosed as a sociopath is that you can't be until you're an adult. And so it's him wrestling with that, and he really nails. He spends a lot of time on research, so he really nails that, and it's fascinating because you get to see his mind tick.
Yeah.
Well, and George Martin does this over and over again with his characters as well. You come across characters that you don't have point of view with initially, and you come to dislike them, but then he totally turns the tables on you and shows them what they're thinking, why they are like they are, and you start to understand. You may still not like what they do, but you do sympathize with them.
There are not a lot of female anti-hero characters, though. That's something that is interesting to me, that I feel like, and maybe this is just me, but I feel like people are much more willing to go on that journey with a male protagonist or anti-hero than they are with the female. If you think about it, there are not a lot of female anti-heroes.
The movie Monster comes to mind.
Yeah, based on a real thing.
Yeah, I can't think of any off the top of my head either.
I mean, I can think of people who are dysfunctional, characters who are dysfunctional, but that's not the same as an anti-hero.
Yeah.
And it's harder, I mean, that may just be a reflection of real life, because, it's harder for me as a woman to be, aggressive and straightforward without being seen as, oh, I have to keep this clean, don't I?
Relatively.
Rhymes with witch.
I think bitch is acceptable. I think.
Okay.
Well,
since you've gone there, I should have just said.
I will shoulder the burden for that if we are off script with that word.
But it may be. I mean, that may be a thing See, now I want to write a female
Yeah,
anti-hero.
I know. It's very intriguing, right?
I called dibs on it real quick. Copyright.
Sure, as soon as you finish that next book.
Ouch.
Ow.
Sorry.
But actually, I think it's true. Part of it might be the fact that we do have a bit of a paucity of female characters comparatively in fantasy in general. Although in urban fantasy, it's the other way around.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe after urban fantasy spends enough time kind of having its foundation of standard heroes, then people are going to start kind of reacting to it and doing variations on the theme.
Yeah.
But I do think you're right. I think the other thing with that might complicate the anti-hero is if a woman is a mother, certain activities are really profoundly unacceptable from the cultural viewpoint. Like I know somebody, actually wasn't it in Joe Walton's novel, among others, she read a version of The Tempest where Prospero was a woman.
Yeah.
And she said Prospero can't work as a woman because a mother who does that to a child, it loses all potential sympathy. They're viewed as like it's a deal breaker. You can't come back from that. And so a mother anti-hero, I think you'd have to overcome so much cultural baggage for that person to not just be like horrifying or a charming serial killer or sociopath. They'd be like violating rules, like maybe way down in the lizard brain area where we couldn't take that.
Yeah. What about Wicked?
Boy, that whole book was kind of just like a character study, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, arguably that's a female anti-hero.
But he was sort of showing her why she was misunderstood. It wasn't so much that he was reinstilling those. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I feel like that's...
She was
Yeah.
It's heading in that direction for sure. It's definitely the closest thing I can think of.
So here's the thing. Before we go too far down that road and we can't come back. Okay, I'm going to go a little farther down that road.
No.
Is it a first-person point of view thing? These characters who we like, they're either from drama, like a play, where people soliloquize their thoughts. Is that the proper pronunciation of that?
Yes.
Or they're first-person point of view novels, or they're television. So the reason Dexter works is that actor sells it. He is charming, and so he's got charisma like out the wazoo. And so you see him, and you're charmed by him despite the action he's taking. But that's a physical thing that you're watching.
Plus, there's backstory too. They show flashbacks and voiceover.
Yeah, that's true. You can't pin it all on the actor. But is it all about knowing the internal process? Can we think of characters who we love that we never see the inside of their heads?
That's tough.
I think that might be the deal breaker.
Yeah, I think you've got to. It gets back to that old adage: everybody is the hero of their own story.
Yeah.
You can have people who are cold-blooded killers, like pretty much anyone, like Scott Lynch's Lies of Locke Lamora. It's these are criminals and they're pulling a heist, and yet we are totally rooting for them to succeed. Ocean's 11, although these are all guys again.
Yeah.
Thelma and Louise.
You said it was like the Hun. Oh, sorry. You go, Brad.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was thinking about Cersei Lannister a little bit. It seems like Martin tried to paint her as a bit of an anti-hero, but I'm actually not sure of his intention because he's so good at it, and she didn't come across that way to me. She actually came across a bit touched, and I think that's how he wanted us to think of her, as a woman who's lost it a little bit and is still, despite knowing her, unsympathetic.
Yeah. Now let's think about the other. I'm curious about the other side of this because when I was writing my stuff, I knew that if people didn't like the character, the book couldn't succeed because it was going to be the story of a person's life. But that's kind of the extreme end of the spectrum, where for an autobiography, it's all about that character.
Right.
I just recently, I was on a panel and I said something about, well, Stephen King does this great thing where he's really good with character. He'll introduce a character, you get stuff from their point of view, and then they die. But, you know, Stephen King can do that because he's a great writer and he's great with point of view. And somebody else stepped in and said, no, actually, he isn't good with that. It actually is making stuff. He's not great with point of view. It's other things that are really selling that story. But can we think of books that are good without really good characters on the other end of the spectrum? Because if we can bookend this issue, I think we learn something about the role that they would play in these stories, what sort of stories they work in.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You go, Brett.
Well, I was going to mention Ready Player One. I think people like that book because of the gaming geeky goodness that it brings to the table. All the nostalgia that you live through. I don't think it was the greatest example of a character novel I've ever read. I liked the characters, but they weren't particularly deep for me. So that would be one example on my end.
Yeah.
There's something aspirational about these kind of characters that we're talking about now, where you can kind of place yourself, especially in Ready Player One, you can place yourself into the protagonist position. And I see that a lot in urban fantasy too, with these female protagonists that are sort of, in some ways, they're a little flat to me, and it's because it's so easy to just stick yourself right in, like you feel like you're them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I was thinking about Asimov, actually, as someone who writes stories that are incredibly compelling, but the characters are fairly flat.
I've heard some people say that that's part of the appeal of Twilight, is it's very easy to project onto that character, and that's what makes the story so functional for a certain age group. You know, is you wear it like a suit of clothes or a mask.
You mean the moms that watched or read Twilight? Less the teenagers, more the moms.
You're thinking of 50 Shades of Grey there. That's.
I haven't read that yet, but it's on the list.
But I think that can go either way. I mean, Brad and I both went to Orson Scott Card's literary boot camp, and one of the things that he does very deliberately is he does not do any character description unless absolutely forced to, because he feels like that allows everyone to build their own picture of the character and do that, you know, layering of putting the character on like clothes. The other end of that, though, is, you know, people who actually do full-out character descriptions with the idea that it makes the character more tangible. And I'm not actually. This is something that I go back and forth on whether or not it's important to have a character that is more fully described. So I would be interested in hearing what other people think about, like, where they land on the spectrum, either as writers or readers.
I'll jump in very firmly on less is more. I read something that Zelazny wrote ages ago, and he said, I never use more than 3 details to describe a character.
Right.
And I remember reading that, and I'm like, wow, that makes really good sense. He picks 3 really good details and figures, and his point was, if you give a ton, then people are going to pick and choose which ones they remember. But if you pick 3 really good ones, they'll latch on to them. And I've always kind of followed that rule of thumb. I think he actually said, I do 2, and then maybe I'll sneak in a 3rd later. Right. And it really makes you make some hard choices. And I do try to follow that rule, at least in terms of physical description. On the other end of the spectrum, I think of it as the police sketch, where you get like a whole page of like all about the character, and he was 6'4", and he weighed this much, and the hair was like this, and what he was wearing. And I mean, unless it's done really well, that's the point at which I want to skim in a book.
Right.
And I know I'm going to miss important things, but I still, I don't know what a Peter Pan collar is. I don't, you know, if you put that information in, I get lost. So.
Have you guys read? Help me out. It's called Understanding Comics, and I'm blanking on the. Was it Doug something?
It was Scott McCloud.
Scott McCloud. So what Mary said was interesting about Orson Scott Card and not painting a lot. In that book, Scott McCloud talks about comics and how they are portrayed and how the art portrays a story along with the words. And he talks about representational versus presentational. And I'm totally forgetting which is which at this point because they sound so similar. But at one end of the spectrum, you have artwork that is very detailed.
Yeah.
And at the other end of the spectrum, you have artwork that is very generalized. And the more generalized you make it, the more people can relate to that particular drawing. If it's a drawing of a boy or a girl or whatever, the more generic or loosely defined it is, the more relatable it is.
Yeah, I think that's especially true in terms of the physical description, because obviously the actions a person takes and the motivation in their life are concrete in a story. But if you leave the physical description very vague, it's a little easier, especially like in a first-person narrative, to like slip behind that character's eyes and have a little vicarious story experience there.
There's something interesting. I was just rereading The Illustrated Man, you know, the Ray Bradbury collection, and he's so interesting the way he deals with description, because so many times he flips it. Where like, you know, you're reading a story about, you know, everybody that's on Mars is African American, and they're waiting for this one white guy who's going to show up in this rocket ship. And I think, you know, he does it not in that collection, but another one. I think he does it where he talks about, you know, this guy coming to Mars and the Martians, and the guy's African American. And I think sometimes, you know, with description, we tend to just go, everybody's white.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So sometimes it's nice if you're, doesn't have to say, oh, I'm Hispanic or I'm Chinese, but like there are ways to describe somebody so you know they're coming from a different culture.
Well, and this is, yeah, and this is the thing that I've been thinking about too, is that if you don't put any description in except when they're different, that you're establishing.
That's not good. Yeah.
Right, because you're reestablishing white as the norm, which is right out as and that's why I struggle with the, you know, trying to decide in part. I swear I will come up with a sentence that's actually a full sentence here, but that's part of why I'm struggling, is because I just finished working on a novel which is set in 1907 Nashville, Tennessee, and my main character is an African American woman, and I realized that default assumption would be flipped to some degree, but also I wound up describing everybody's race when they walked into the scene, because I couldn't rely on my audience to make the assumption.
Yeah, I did a satirical article for a newspaper once where I just wrote a regular article, and then I just made a point of explaining that everyone in there was white. You know, I was just write, you know, so-and-so, you know, a Caucasian male, you know, and when you do that, you're like, boy, this seems really weird. But I know some people have a problem doing it on the other side, and this is a character I was actually going to bring up on the far end of the spectrum in terms of like relatable, tangible, lovable characters in an otherwise like amazing story. Shadow in American Gods.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Shadow is almost a non-character. And Gaiman is so good at what he does, it has to be deliberate. And it's even mentioned in the story, like somebody mentions his old girlfriend comes in and says, you know, it's almost like you were never a real person. Sometimes I would come into a room and you'd be sitting in the dark, not doing anything, not even watching TV, you know, and he was just sort of like a moving pane of glass through which you experience the story. And are we completely lagged out here?
No.
No.
Okay, I can see you move now. But
Well, you're just so like compelling. We're just
Fixated on the screen.
the other part of it though is that Shadow is black.
Yeah.
And it's only like at one point, because what happens is every time he comes into a room, people go, "Boy, you're a big one," and that's it. Except I think in one place his skin is described as like coffee colored, and like that is it in a 350,000 word book, and it was just it was interesting finding that in the second read through. And I'm like, wow, should this have been something I've known? But there's so much I don't know about Shadow. That character was really, in a lot of ways, unimportant to the story itself. Yeah.
I actually remember a moment in one of the Heinlein books. It might have been The Cat Who Walks Through Walls, but Lazarus Long had had his foot cut off and a new one put on from a donor. And I remember it saying that it looked like he had on a white sock.
Oh, yeah.
And there is nothing anywhere else in the book that indicates that his skin is anything other than Caucasian. And I remember hitting that and just being, and it kicked me out of the story. And I think that's something that you can do deliberately to challenge readers' assumptions. But I also think that you wind up paying a cost when you do that, and you have to decide whether or not that's something you want to do. And I think that's the case with any description, that if you introduce a detail later, like you were saying, Pat, that if it's something that the audience has imagined something else, that you wind up running into trouble.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, for just talking about, instead of race, sex, from the two women folk on this here cast, what is the default sex for the character that you're reading? Because I've read a lot of kind of newer writers that write stories in first person, and they don't mention a name right away, and so you're not totally clear what the sex is. That's usually a very easily fixable thing, or maybe something that you're consciously doing. But of course, while I'm reading, I'm picturing a guy. What do you guys think? What is the default?
A guy. I default to the sex of the author, unless the voice is really good, and then usually male.
Right. Yeah, and then there's the question of, is there a female voice? Is there a male voice? If I'm reading, but I do know exactly what you mean, where some people have a distinctive voice and it paints the whole character, including the sex, the social class, and all of this. But it does happen to me, especially in a lot of short stories, first person. I read them and I'm like, whoop, oh, wrong. I'm in the wrong sex. And 3 pages of a short story, I've almost got to put it down. I'll come back in a week and try it again.
Yeah. I one of the things that I do when I'm teaching is. Because I feel like a lot of description can actually be handled through point of view. The details that a character notices vary wildly depending on who the character is. And so I'll ask students to just describe a room, and then I'll ask them to go back and describe exactly the same room as like a fireman or a teacher or a janitor or something like that. But that I do not want them at any point to say, I am a fireman. That it's just by the details that you notice, because the fireman comes in, he notices the fire exits, he notices where the windows are, he notices that they probably used flame retardant on the curtains, and you know that this man is probably a fireman. Someone else comes in and spots the trash can hasn't been emptied, there are spots on the floor, and he would probably use Windex more frequently, and you're like,
right, that's good.
And then spitballs everywhere. But I feel like that's one way to deal with character description with either first person or third person, is because that way you can get away with giving the internal state of the character who is observing, as well as telling something about the character that is being observed.
Yeah.
In puppetry.
There we go. We've been waiting
Focus
for it.
indicates thought. I told you. Focus indicates thought. What your character is looking at is what your character is thinking about.
Lee Child is really good at that first person, thing with his character. The Jack Reacher stuff. I mean, they're like crack to me. Like I read those books in like 2 seconds, and they're just like drugs, candy. But like he's really good about, because he is such a specific character with such a specific history. Like the way he sees things is like he walks in a room and he sees things in a very specific way because of his military police background and stuff, and that terseness of how he writes that character is so interesting to me. I don't think it would work for. I get in arguments with my mom about this because my mom is a budding novelist, and she's like, I love Lee Child. I love how terse he is and simple. I want to write like that, and I'm like, yeah, but it won't work for like a cozy romance, or a cozy mystery.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, completely, because it's the language that a person uses is so
Specific to them.
Yes, exactly.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
You just wrote.
Yep. I've taken out the earbuds here to free up the speakers. One thing I do want to mention quickly is you brought up Heinlein. In his book, I Will Fear No Evil, I hear that he was deliberately obscure on the subject of race, and that was told, I'm pretty sure, from a first-person viewpoint, and or it was from the viewpoint of a man who ended up in a woman's body.
Oh, yeah.
And apparently he had a picture of 2 beautiful women by his computer, and one of them was black, and one of them was white, and he would use both of them as kind of a reference, but deliberately did not mention race all the way through it. So just to touch on that, I also, we have kind of a strange opportunity here, because I am traveling right now. We have the potential for a guest speaker or someone who might be able to make a comment or two on the nature of explaining character. We actually have Terry Brooks here. In the
Oh,
wow. I'm going to give up my chair here.
Take up the road.
Okay.
And
I'm not Patrick Rothfuss.
not we should turn that
Not
off.
even close.
We need a new lower third for him.
Yeah. And this would be maybe a nice segue into the end of the show, where we could talk a little bit about tips for doing it. How can you portray
Not that.
interesting characters, like tips and tricks that work well in books? Mary mentioned how the voice or what a person recognizes reveals so much about a character. I think that's absolutely true, and I don't see that used as well as it could be. What else do people think? Good tricks.
Well, I'll say something really quick. I was listening to the discussion a few minutes ago about detailing characteristics of your characters in the book in order to identify what they're like and represent them. But I'm sort of of the camp that sometimes this less is more thing plays out in another way, and that's that you want to not do too much with any character because you want to allow your reader to meet you halfway. And that means that you let your reader have the opportunity to form a vision of what this character looks like, acts like, behaves like, beyond what you do in your work, what you set out for them. So you give them that couple things to work with and let them form the character. And then they're more of a participant rather than just somebody watching from the sidelines.
Yeah, it's like the crying rule, or in live theater, which is that if you bring your character right up to the edge of crying, but don't actually go there, the audience will almost always cry for you.
Mm.
Wow.
Or at least in children's theater.
Well, that's
We can use that as a tagline to market this. Mary Robnett Quall teaches us about puppetry and how to make children cry.
Yeah, we had what we called the P factor when we went into schools. But that was a whole different thing.
The P factor, excuse me?
It's how scary a show is. You can count it by how many small puddles there are in the jacuzzi.
Wow.
Which is not actually a helpful writing tip. So let's get back to those.
Well, I'll mention a couple of quick things. One is a mistake that I made through my first couple of novels, and that is first impressions. We all want to make our characters complex. They want to be, deep. They want to have different interests. But I wanted initially to have my characters be sort of the everyman or the every woman. And to do that, I wanted to show them as a bit weak so that they could grow into the role that they were about to take on in this story. But if you show weakness first, that's a really huge mistake. You have to be really careful with that stuff. And because those things last. Just like in life, they last for a long time. It's really hard to undo that first impression once it's been set. And the other thing I'll mention quickly is Pat and I have talked about this at some panels at Gen Con, falling into the character. I think, once you have your character set, that's one thing. But portraying it on the page is another. And it's really difficult, at least it is for me, to truly fall into the character. It's like method acting in a way. And when you find those moments where you can actually fall into the character and really become them, those are golden. Those are really, I won't say rare, but you should take advantage of them and try to recreate that however you can. Get yourself in that same mindset. And I think that's when some of the magic comes out in those first drafts.
In the subject of first impressions, I think about that a lot if I read a newer writer's manuscript or story. A lot of times you get a ton of description, and maybe we walk with him through a part of his day, and what they're setting a scene and they're doing things, and I know why they're making those choices, but ultimately we don't really know a character until we see them do something.
Yes.
And that first thing a character does is really the first impression. Doesn't matter how much you describe them. When they make a choice, when they make an active choice, that is the first impression. And so that action should count. And that doesn't mean they kill a dragon on page 3. That just means some sort of active, engaged discussion. It reveals so much about character. You don't want to blow that opportunity.
Yeah, and I completely agree. It's I think the first impressions thing is great. One of the things that we used to talk about when I was doing the theater stuff heavily was action is reaction. That the way you respond to the things around you illuminates character and the choices that the character decides to make. Amber, you actually probably have spent more time doing this kind of character stuff, because I mean, I'm when I'm talking about character stuff, I'm like, hi, and and although there can be deep character stuff, I'm constrained to a certain degree by what piece of fur I've picked up.
There's things that you ask as an actor coming in to take a character on after an author has given it life. Like, you take it to another level, and you always want to know, like, why is the character there? What does the character want from a scene? What is a character looking for from the other people that they're interacting with? And I think that applies when you're writing a character as well. You have to kind of know what the character wants. Why are they in this situation? How do they react to things? And it's the same principle, you know, whether it's a puppet or a human being, you know. Because look at Kermit the Frog. Like, he makes me feel things that there are a lot of actors out there that do not make me feel those things. It's not easy being green.
No, so true. But it's it is that what do you know the stereotype. What's my motivation?
Yeah,
it's so true. Like when I run into a problem when I'm writing, it's almost always that I have forgotten what my character's motivation, what their reason for being there is.
Yeah, agreed.
I think that's great. A lot of times people talk about the iceberg, where like for your world you don't want to explain all your world. You want to show 10%, and the rest you just know and you leave out. And everybody accepts that as true about world building. But I think people forget that it should also be true about character.
Yes.
You should know all these things about the character, not so you can put them in, but so you can leave them out. Tim Powers once said, you need to know when this guy last washed his shirt.
No, you don't.
No. John Scalzi says that he answers questions for his characters in the world 2 questions deep. So he's like, well, why is he cranky this morning? Because he didn't eat breakfast. Well, why didn't he eat breakfast? Because he was running late. Well, why was he running late? I don't know.
But think of it this way, like any actor should know like what a character is about and where they. I always like to say like you should know where they were before the scene started and where they're going after. You as the author should know all this. You don't have to put it in the book.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Oh, I know that so much. Thank you. Thank you for saying it out loud.
The other thing that I've been giving some talks the last couple of years on a bit to do with world building, and it's actually more about characters and plot. But I think world building is kind of a sometimes forgotten part of character building. The characters are not the cultures that they come from, but they're born of it, and they can. If they don't completely define the characters, they can at least define some of the opposition, some of the tension that these characters have to face, either internally or externally. And so if you can spend a lot of time on your world, the cultures, the religions, the customs, on and on, the expectations that you have from your family, of yourself, that can advise character.
Mm-hmm.
You were going to say?
I was just going to say that one of the things that sets books apart from other forms of world building or character representation in other formats is that you have interior monologue.
Yeah.
Tells us about characters is what's going on in their heads, and sometimes it's false, but sometimes it's real, and their reactions to things and what lives in their head and is bugging them or what drives their motivations and so on comes through in their interior monologue, and I use that a lot to define the characters that I write about.
Yeah, and I love that when it's done to a good purpose. And I've seen sometimes it's unfortunate you get duplication of effort, where somebody thinks about why they're going to do something and then they do it. Mm-hmm. Whereas I would like to see somebody have their interior monologue and then do something else, or just watch them do the thing and then I'll draw my own conclusions, because you don't want to waste the time.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, doing both.
It's all about structure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I am actually going to pull out a puppet for this because it's
Yay.
So we say focus indicates thought, so what your puppet is looking at is what it's thinking about. Breath indicates emotion, so how your puppet feel goes through, So I can show you that the puppet is sad just by the action. But if I then go, I'm sad, it's like, oh, please tell me now. And the things that are, the things that make bad children's theater make bad books, too.
But what's something that's interesting to me is like the difference between literary fiction and like genre fiction. I feel like a lot of times with literary fiction, it's all internal monologue and less like action, and more like why you look at like The Stranger by Camus, and it's all why this person did this, and it's this like this mediation on we're meditating on why this character did this rather than being in the present of watching them do this. And I think, so in some ways, there has to be that balance between you're writing an action-oriented thing, not like shoot 'em up, bang bang action, but like a story that's in the present or the past that's moving, and more of like a character, like study of a person. And that interior monologue is so important for the more literary fiction, because I want to understand why someone is doing what they're doing. It's very appealing to me as a reader.
Yeah. Well, how about on the other end of the spectrum? We've talked about some of the good tips and tricks. Let's briefly, before we throw it open to questions from the audience, maybe just one from each of us, things that you see people do in books and it really gets to you most of the time, where it's one of your peeves, a character thing that you really think people should cut back on.
Terry's got a good one. I can see it. I can see it in the
I'm like, yeah, go Terry.
Well, I don't like. Now I've probably done this, and I'm going to screw myself. But I don't like it when there's when the physical description of the character is overdone, and I see it done all the time. And I don't need to know. I don't really need to know all this stuff about the character, because I don't care what they look like. I'd rather form that impression myself rather than listening to long descriptions about hair color and eye color and shape of face and on and on and on. If they got a problem, I want to know about that. If they limp, or if they're favoring something, there's something about the way they move. That's more interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the thing that drives me crazy is when they have an internal deep flashback about motivation in the middle of a giant freaking action scene. He was running down the hall with an axe, and the smell of the blood reminded him of his mother's apple pies when he was a small child back in Minnesota. And I'm just like, no!
I might have done that. I apologize. That might have happened. I apologize.
I wasn't going to say
action. Never slow the action. Never slow the momentum.
Yeah, I hate it when there's repetition in thought and words and deed. Sometimes young authors, new authors, forget about or don't yet know about subtext. They feel like they have to kind of pound things into you to make you understand, where about a third of what they actually put on the page would do just fine. Kind of related to what you just said, Mary, with doing one thing and saying another, but internalizing stuff like that is also just it's too much.
I'll tell you what's important for description is when you're about to have sex with somebody in a book. I want to know what they look like before I have sex with them. That's basically the only time when I want to.
I didn't think about the fact that that's. Oh, sorry.
No, I'm just laughing at myself.
No, I'm like, that's why in the romance genre description is so much more heavily favored, I'll bet.
Yep.
Huh.
Yeah.
I want to know what his pecs look like. I know I can look at the cover, but I want more description. I want to know what his male parts look like. That's or their female parts. You know what I mean? I want to know how big the boobs are, right? If I'm going to have sex with her, I want to know. That's when description is important.
So what are you writing next? 52 Shades of what?
Of a hamburger, of course.
Oh, we could sell that. So maybe let's. Do we have some questions from the audience here? We are.
Yes, we do.
Questions up above.
Mm-hmm.
That said, showing the fact that he is not that good.
So, as a child, what book was most influential to you before the age of 16? From Andrew Seeley. That would be actually. I'm going to jump on that. That would actually be Louisa May Alcott's *The Old-Fashioned Girl*. She manages to slip in a lot of very useful life lessons without actually moralizing.
And this is a weird character example, but Aslan.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you never see Aslan's thoughts.
No.
He's a Gandalf. He does not explain himself deliberately, but like right now, I can feel what his mane feels like. You know, because there's like the Penzi kids, was that their last name?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They would kind of go in and they would smell, and I can smell what Aslan smells like.
Yeah.
And I don't know, part of that is probably the books, and part of it is the fact that those were my very first chapter books.
Yeah.
But I think that is a great example of how a little description and a little very good dialogue can, like, that lasts forever. That's lasted 30 years for me.
Yeah. I know Andrew McFeely. He's a friend of mine. He totally salted the question. Hi, Andrew. I'm trying to think, you know, like, I read a lot of fantasy as a kid, and I got super into, like, Diana Wynne Jones, the fantasy books, and the Christopher Chant books or whatever, you know, and I think about those characters a lot. I think about how science and like, the multiverse, like, she was talking about multiverse theory. Do you know what I mean? And, like, I was, like, 8 or 9, and the same with the, you know, the Lion, the Lion, the Lich, and the Lore, with those books as well. You know, like, there's something magical about, like, about imagination and fantasy and science and all of that stuff. That was so potent to me as a child. And those characters were learning, you know, what's her name? Madeline L'Engle also, like, there was this, like, these characters were like me, and they were learning these amazing things, and that was really important to me, and I think that's why I like fantasy so much.
I wanted to be Charles Wallace.
Oh my God, I know.
Yes, I know. I associated with Meg so much.
Yes.
Except for the part where she was good with math.
How about you, Brad? What early book?
Yeah, it'd have to be an oldie but a goodie. It's The Hobbit and eventually The Lord of the Rings. I remember going to a new school back in 3rd grade. I switched and I met a new friend, Jim Vogt. I even remember his name, and he had read it, and he kind of tipped me to it. And before that, I'd not been a huge reader. I remember reading, like, the Hardy Boys and the Nancy Drew, you know, mysteries and things. And but The Hobbit just opened my eyes. I loved that. I love the depth and breadth of that world. And it's actually been hard for me since then. It made such an impression that I have trouble wanting to read other things besides fantasy. Once I start them, I do enjoy science fiction, horror once in a while, but my true love is fantasy.
How about you, Terry? An early book that had a really memorable character in it, or characters that really stuck to you?
You mean besides The Naked and the Dead?
I don't know that one.
I'm a slightly older than you are, so I'll just... You know, I was reading all science fiction also in the early days, but I think the Oz books made the biggest impression on me when I was... there wasn't much fantasy out there, and they're not popular fantasy anyway, so the Oz books were the books I remember the best.
Yeah. We've got a question that says, how does the use of unreliable narrator impact character building? I might twist that a little bit and just say, you know, have anybody used this or seen it used real well, the unreliable narrator?
Yes. Liar by Christine Labalestier is a brilliant use of the unreliable narrator. And it's a YA novel, and the character is a compulsive liar, and you know that, but you don't know which pieces are real and which pieces aren't. And she makes a really excellent use of it.
I love her.
Well, and Amber, didn't you mention Population 12?
Yeah, Jim Thompson.
Yeah, I don't consider that an unreliable
No,
but
not in the same way, but
what that character thinks about in this first-person report, it evolves very naturally, where at some point you're like, oh, I've made a bunch of assumptions, you know, because his thoughts have been focusing on the matters at hand, and then there's a little clue dropped and a little clue dropped, and eventually you're like, whoa, I thought I was talking to somebody else.
Yeah.
And that's a really, if you haven't read that book and you're interested in first-person point of view, you have to read it.
Great. There's another one called The Egyptologist. You guys remember this? That's another total unreliable narrator. You think you're on one journey, and then you realize, oh, something's not right here. Sorry if I spoiled it.
Yeah, the Sixth Sense jumps to mind.
Oh.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that can be more challenging to write, but what Terry was saying earlier about the reader coming halfway, meeting you halfway. This is kind of one of those things that gives the reader a chance to be smart, and the more chances you give them to be smart, the more they enjoy the travel, in your story.
Yeah. I read a murder mystery once, which I will not name because it would be a complete spoiler, which was written in first person, and the narrator was the murderer.
Yeah.
And there were, in fact, enough clues dropped all the way through that you should have gotten it. But he was busily trying to solve the murder, which was actually him trying to cover it up.
Yeah, that's great.
So maybe one more question here. I see we have, and this is a good one to maybe just throw out some quick pieces of advice before we wrap up. Somebody asks, Hunter asks, how far into a character's thoughts should you go without risking losing the reader's attention? Whereas if you hold back too much, the character might seem kind of shallow. I think that's a huge question, because I know I've been bored by internal monologue. That's always the classic criticism of literary fiction. Is I always think of it as a guy staring out into the rain, thinking about his and like drinking tea, and that's the whole novel. But that's unfair. But that's what I think about when I think about too much internal monologue. How does everyone decide where to draw the line?
Well, I think for me it's somewhat similar to exposition. In that the trick for me is to make the reader want to have those internalizations before you give them. So you set up little mini mysteries that make you wonder why this character is doing what they're doing, and then you can dole those things out, and the reader is actually interested instead of bored.
Maybe it's, Brad, maybe it's a case of having the character do something first, behave in a particular way, and then you get into what the motivation is for the behavior, so you have something to play off of.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, something to kick in the reader's curiosity that you then satisfy. It makes them pick it up.
Sorry, I'm getting a storm is kicking up, so I actually have to go close my door. I'm gonna.
Ozzy's coming! The great and powerful Oz! Come to his house!
So I'm explaining my motivation. I'm explaining my motivation before I do the action.
Yeah, you should have done the action first, Mary.
It's actually just a reference to a book that you should check out. It's A Wind in the Door, right?
another lingo classic. I try and make it funny sometimes when I'm doing interior monologue. Sometimes that makes things a little more palatable. Things that you feel like you need to get across sometimes in exposition or in interior monologue. If you make it funny or you find humor in it, sometimes it's a little more palatable. I don't know.
I'm totally jealous of people that can pull off humor. I'm just terrible at it.
Well,
That's tough.
I may not actually be pulling it off, so I don't know. But I'm trying. So if I like to think if I can make them laugh, they'll go with me anyway, right?
Yeah. The way I handle it is to do as little internal monologue as possible and try to use my other tools to let people know what my reader is thinking. So, getting back to the focus indicates thought thing. There's a big difference between the man walked into the room and there was a blonde sitting in a chair, and the man walked into the room and in the chair was a blonde. Even that small a tweak can make a difference in perception. But if when I get into breath or rhythm, which is how long you focus on something, which explains emotion. And it's like the man walked into the room. There was a blonde sitting in the chair. She had long legs and hair that curled down to the base of her spine. Very different from the man walked into the room. There was a blonde sitting in the chair. The chair was a fine bent hardwood with an embroidered needle, probably from the early 1800s. And I don't actually have to tell you what his thought process is, that he's an antique dealer or anything like that, because I'm using my description and the rest of the tools that I have. And I don't have to get into internal motivation until I need to explain an action that is ambiguous, and that's where I start to bring in my internal motivation, when it's something that is not, that there could be multiple reasons, and I want to make sure that the reason that the audience gets is the one that I want them to get. Otherwise, I'm quite content to let them fill it in on their own.
So, Mary, are you saying that you save those moments until they're most important?
Yeah. Using my man and the blonde in the chair. If I add in an action, the man walked into the room. There was a blonde sitting in the chair. He jerked her out of the chair. So I've given you an action, and
glad that's all he did to her.
Yeah, and I've picked a specific verb. I jerked her. He jerked her out of the chair is different than he lifted her out of the chair versus he pulled her out of the chair. But still, there's some ambiguity about why he did that. And if I insert my internal motivation there, the man walked into the room. There was a blonde sitting in the chair. He hadn't seen her since California. My God, she looked good. He pulled her out of the chair. Versus the man walked into the room. There was a blonde sitting in the chair. Couldn't she see that it was broken? He yanked her out of the chair.
Yeah.
And that's where I will slip in the internal motivation, and I will try to keep it as compressed as possible, just enough that the audience understands what's happening.
Right.
Yeah. I cheat a little bit, and actually I've never thought of it in terms of puppetry, but for obvious reasons. But I try to ride the brakes on the internal monologue, whereas instead I do a lot with characters' body language.
Yes.
So in their dialogue, I'll have somebody lean forward, or I'll have them sigh, or I'll have them roll their eyes. I actually have to constantly go in and weed out all of my nodding.
Yes.
Me too.
Yeah. Nodding and looking.
Yeah. But
yeah.
that can really communicate a lot of the internal thought process. And then again, I save my I pick my moment for when I need it.
The other place that I use it is decision moments, where the character is on the cusp of making a decision, and I think that that's something that the audience likes to see. When they're conflicted and why they make that choice. So I will sometimes go into it there, but if I've done my job leading up to that, I usually don't need to do a whole bunch of it.
Cool. So,
I went back, though. I was thinking that question about, describing people, and who's really good at, leaving things open-ended is Paul Auster. He gives them all, color names, and you never quite know what anything is. You just get, the why. Less of the who and the what, and more of the why things happen, which I find really intriguing. Sorry, I just was thinking about that a while ago, and I forgot to mention that. Sorry. You can end us now. Sorry, Pat. I usurped your position.
I always, with my own stuff, I always worry about rambling on. And although this is a great panel, try to keep it a little bit towards an hour, because I always want to leave them wanting a little more. Last comments. Oh, and books with great characters, or authors who write great characters, to leave our viewers with some recommendations. Terry? Can you think of anyone that does it particularly, if not irritatingly well?
That me? You call me?
That's the writer that comes to mind at the moment, who I've been reading for a while, and I like a great deal, is a writer named Just Walter. And he has nothing to do with fantasy, but he writes stories that are particularly engaging about strange things. He wrote a book called The Zero, which is essentially about 9/11, but it's about a lot of other things too, and it's mostly about a character who has lost his memory because of 9/11, and he's reliving it in snippets. So the whole book is written in snippets that suddenly end abruptly. And that maybe is the best character I've ever seen, and he gets away with this. And you really want to know more about this person, and it does all of the things that I want to see happen with the character. It leaves me wanting to know more. It leaves me imagining some of the things that aren't there.
Yeah.
It creates a dislike or anything. They're silent. There's
Oh yeah.
Sorry, I have like there's like a motorcycle going by. That was me. I apologize. It got really loud there. Did you guys hear it? I hope you didn't hear it. Sorry.
No.
No.
Okay.
I think.
I had.
Go ahead.
Oh, I turned to look back at my bookshelf, trying to figure. It's like I could list so many, but Guy Gavriel Kay. I keep going back to his books. And I feel like one of the things that he does is his characters have more than one reason for doing things, and I think that is really I think that's very true to life, and so I find his characters very compelling. And then going back in time, Jane Austen, she's kind of brilliant at it.
To go even further back in time, I'll pick Chaucer.
Oh, really? As a character guy?
Well, think about the prologue. Chaucer,
Okay.
Think of the miller. He had a mouth like a great furnace. There was not a door that he could not heave off its head, or break by running at it with its head. His beard was flat as a spade, and it was red as a sow's bristle. I'm like, I know that guy.
Yeah.
And Shakespeare and Chaucer rhymed while he did that description too.
Right.
It's so, each of those descriptions is almost like a study in how to describe a character.
Mm-hmm.
And you need some footnotes sometimes to unpack it, given the time difference. But if I ever get to teach like just a creative writing class or just a character development class, we're looking at the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. It's so tight and so condensed. It's like lightning when it hits you.
I will have to go back and look at that.
I'll mention a couple quickly. I mentioned Mark Lawrence's Prince of Thorns earlier. I'll also mention Ian Tregillis's Bitter Seeds. It's part of the Milkweed triptych, and this is kind of a George Martin's Wild Cards series meets World War II and the aftermath that follows. Some really great characters, including a young girl named Gretel, who can see the most probable future, and she's kind of creepy in her motivations. And the other one is relative newcomer Rob Ziegler wrote a book called Seed, and it has several main point of view characters, but the ones I associate with the most was Brood. This is a green apocalypse novel set in the American Southwest, and it's a real vicious story about Brood trying to get back to what he considers home, essentially. Very well done characters.
I guess I kind of have to go to some of the Southern writers, like Harper Lee.
Yes.
And then you go to Steinbeck, like The Grapes of Wrath. Some of the character description and just the essence of who these characters are. Just it's so beautiful, and you know there's a lot of stuff going on, and sometimes it gets a bit. East of Eden is another great one where he does like these characters. They're real, breathing human beings to me. And even though Steinbeck's on the south, I said Southern first, so Harper Lee, but then Steinbeck obviously West Coast. But and Tennessee Williams is another one. These living, breathing creatures. that I get really excited about, because you feel connected to them, and you know people that are these people, and you see their pettiness and their humanness, and how two things that are so disparate can exist in one human being. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Faulkner is great like that also.
Yeah. Eudora Welty wrote a story about an old woman walking into town. I wish I could remember the title of it, but it's a story where it's just about an old woman walking into town, which is hard for an old woman to do. It's miles and miles, and it's absolutely riveting. And it's as much about her as the journey, and it's just such a great example of why you do not need a dragon or a goblin army to make fantasy interesting. I mean, I'm not saying that dragons aren't interesting too. You might as well get both if you can get it. You know, dragon and the character. So we could go on forever, but there does have to be an end. I can't thank you all enough again for doing this. I can't thank Terry enough for, even though I sprang that on you, I'm so sorry to do that on the spur of the moment.
It's okay.
But it's such to have you. And this is Pat Rothfuss with the storyboard, and saying see you next month.